The golden sun drapes Holliston Park in a warm glow, casting long shadows over winding paths and quiet picnic tables. It's a picture of suburban peace. Parents pushing strollers, joggers lost in their rhythm, and children laughing near the playground. But for 16-year-old Maya Carter, this park is more than just a scenic retreat. It's her sanctuary. Seated alone at a weathered picnic table, Maya is completely absorbed in her work. Her laptop hums softly, its screen reflecting words from a meticulously crafted report on civil rights history. Highlighters and notes scatter across the wooden surface, evidence of her determination. She's been coming here for years, ever since she was old enough to ride her bike without supervision. It's familiar, safe, or at least, it was. Across the park, a man watches. Richard Calloway, mid-50s, neatly dressed in a crisp polo and an expensive watch, shifts uncomfortably on a nearby bench. His routine is simple: come to the park, check his phone, and enjoy a quiet moment alone. But today, something disrupts his sense of normalcy. Her. She doesn't look dangerous. She isn't causing trouble, but something about Maya, sitting alone, too at ease, too comfortable, makes him uneasy. She doesn't belong here. Not here. His fingers tighten around his phone as his thoughts spiral. What if she's waiting for someone? What if she's planning something? The more he watches, the more his discomfort festers into suspicion. His mind fabricates a narrative, one where Maya isn't a student, but a threat. And just like that, with a simple press of a button, he dials 911. Lexington Police Department. What's your emergency? Richard's voice is steady. Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious. And just like that, a storm is set in motion. But what Richard doesn't know, what he can't know, is that this call will not go the way he expects. Because when Maya's mother arrives, the entire situation is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Before we dive in, let me ask you this. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's assumptions led to something far more serious? What would you have done? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to stay until the very end, because this story is one you won't want to miss. Richard Calloway lowers his phone, his pulse steady, convinced he's done the right thing. His eyes flick back to the picnic table where Maya Carter sits, still typing away, completely unaware that she's just become a suspect in her own neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice was neutral, polite, but efficient. We'll send an officer to check it out. That's all he needed to hear. Now, all that's left is to wait. Minutes pass. The park continues its gentle hum of life. Children squealing as they chase each other near the swings, an elderly couple walking arm in arm, a jogger wiping sweat from his brow. No one else seems concerned. No one else sees what he sees. And yet, Richard remains uneasy. What is she even working on? He watches as Maya reaches into her backpack, pulling out a water bottle. The motion is casual, natural, but in his mind, suspicion flares again. Is she texting someone? Coordinating something? His fingers tap against his knee. The longer she stays, the more convinced he becomes that something isn't right. Then, the distant hum of an approaching engine reaches his ears. He sits up straighter. A black and white police cruiser rolls into the parking lot, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Another one follows. 2 officers step out. Maya doesn't notice at first. Her head remains bowed over her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. She's deep in concentration, her world reduced to words on a screen. Then, "Excuse me, miss." The voice is calm, measured, but firm. Maya blinks, startled, and looks up. 2 uniformed officers stand before her. One tall and lean, his belt lined with tools of authority. Radio, cuffs, holstered gun. The other, stockier, arms crossed over his chest, eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. Maya pulls out an earbud. "Sorry? We got a call," the taller officer says, his gaze flicking down at her laptop. "A report about a suspicious individual in the park. Can we ask what you're doing here?" Maya frowns, confusion flickering across her face. I'm doing homework? She gestures toward her screen, her open notebook, the highlighters, scattered across the table. I have a history paper due next week. The stockier officer exhales sharply through his nose. His stance doesn't shift. His hand remains too close to his belt. You been here long? Maya hesitates. Something about his tone, about the way he's watching her, sends a ripple of unease through her chest. Maybe an hour, she answers slowly. Silence. A charged pause. Then, got some ID on you? Her breath catches. What for? The taller officer's expression doesn't change. Just a routine check. Routine. That word sticks in her throat. She knows it isn't routine for everyone. She's seen plenty of kids at this park. Kids who don't look like her. Laughing, hanging out, eating snacks at this very table. No officers ever approach them. No one asked them for ID. Her fingers twitch toward her bag, and as she moves, the stockier officer shifts. His stance tightens. His fingers graze the edge of his holster. Maya freezes. A heavy silence presses in. Her pulse pounds in her ears. She knows. She's seen stories like this before. I'm just grabbing my wallet, she says carefully, her voice smaller now. She moves slowly, deliberately, exaggerating every motion, as if she has to prove, I'm not a threat. She pulls out her ID and hands it to them. The taller officer, his badge reading Reynolds, takes it, scanning her name, his lips pressed together. Something flickers across his face. Uncertainty, hesitation. Then, a loud honk slices through the tension. A sleek black sedan pulls up fast. The tires barely stop before the driver's side door swings open. And just like that, everything changes. The door slams shut with sharp precision, heels clicking against the pavement in rapid, deliberate strides. Celeste Carter moves like a force of nature, tall, poised, radiating an authority that demands attention. Her navy blue blazer is crisp, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, sharp, unrelenting, sweep the scene in an instant. Maya stiffens. Mom. The officers turn, caught off guard by the sudden arrival. Officer Reynolds clears his throat, shifting his weight. The stockier officer, Martinez, remains rigid, jaw tightening as if bracing for impact. Celeste barely spares them a glance before her gaze locks onto Maya. A quick assessment. Her daughter is unharmed but tense, her fingers clenched against her notebook. Then, Celeste turns to the officers, her voice smooth as steel. Officers, she says, her tone deceptively polite. Is there a problem here? Reynolds straightens, caught between protocol and the unshakable presence now standing before him. Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious individual in the park. We were just checking in. Celeste blinks once, slow and deliberate. Then, she exhales, a humorless chuckle slipping past her lips. Suspicious. The word lingers in the air, heavy with weight. Her gaze flicks to Martinez. And what exactly made my daughter suspicious? Martinez doesn't answer right. Away. The tension in his stance is subtle but noticeable. We were following up on a report, he says, voice clipped. Celeste's expression remains unreadable. A report that said what, exactly? That a teenage girl was sitting at a table, doing homework? Reynolds clears his throat. We were just doing our due diligence. Celeste cocks her head slightly. Due diligence, she repeats, as if tasting the phrase. Then, her voice lowers, quiet but razor sharp. Tell me, officers, how often do you ask for ID from the white teenagers in this park? Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Maya watches, her breath shallow. She's seen her mother in action before, cross-examining witnesses, dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. But this is different. This is personal. Martinez shifts, his fingers twitching slightly. Celeste doesn't move, doesn't blink. She lets the weight of her question settle. Reynolds exhales. "Look, ma'am." "Celeste Carter," she corrects. "Federal Prosecutor Celeste Carter." The shift is immediate. It crackles through the air like electricity. Reynolds' eyes flicker with recognition, his grip on Maya's ID tightening involuntarily. Martinez's shoulders square. Celeste sees it. She knows what just happened, and she doesn't stop. "If you think I don't know my daughter's rights, you're mistaken," she continues, voice smooth but cutting. "Now, I want to know, who made this call?" Reynolds hesitates. "We can't disclose that information." Celeste lets out a slow, measured breath. "Of course you can't." She takes a step forward, gaze locking onto Martinez. "But let me ask you this. Did the caller mention what crime Maya was committing? Or is sitting in a park with a laptop enough to warrant police intervention these days?" Martinez's jaw tightens. "Ma'am, answer the question." Another beat of silence. A shift in power. And from across the park, still sitting stiffly on his bench, Richard Calloway feels a chill crawl up his spine. Because Celeste Carter isn't just another concerned mother. She's a problem. Martinez squares his shoulders, his expression hardening. But there's something else beneath the surface now. Hesitation. He glances at Reynolds, but his partner offers no help. Only a subtle shift of discomfort. Celeste Carter waits, her patience razor thin. "So?" she presses, voice sharp enough to cut. "What exactly was suspicious about my daughter?" Reynolds exhales through his nose, his grip still tight around Maya's ID. He hesitates too long. The silence is damning. Celeste lets out a slow, deliberate breath. Then she smiles. It's not a warm smile. It's the kind of smile that makes men in courtrooms second-guess their entire defense. It's the kind of smile that signals she's about to dismantle their entire justification, brick by brick. "Let me explain something to you, officers." She steps forward, her heels clicking against the pavement, her voice quiet but lethal. "I have spent years prosecuting cases that started exactly like this. Cases where a phone call turns into harassment, where harassment turns into escalation, where escalation turns into a life being destroyed." Martinez shifts. Reynolds' jaw tightens. "You saw a black teenager sitting alone," Celeste continues, her voice unwavering. "And instead of using your own judgment, you let someone else's fear dictate your response. Instead of questioning the legitimacy of the report, you walked in ready to intimidate a child." The word child lands heavily. Maya swallows, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She watches as the officers, so confident just moments ago, begin to unravel under her mother's relentless gaze. Reynolds exhales. "Look, we didn't know she was your daughter." Celeste's eyes narrow. "Would it have made a difference?" Silence. Martinez exhales sharply. "This is getting blown out of proportion." "Is it?" Celeste tilts her head. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like racial profiling. And I'd love to hear another explanation for why. My daughter was treated like a potential criminal for doing homework in a public park." Neither officer speaks. And from across the park, Richard Calloway grips his phone tighter, his stomach twisting. Celeste turns slightly, her gaze flicking past the officers, scanning the park. Her eyes lock onto him. Richard's breath catches in his throat. She takes a step forward. "I assume that was you?" she calls out. A few bystanders, ones who had been pretending not to listen, turn their heads. A jogger slows his pace. A woman near the swings murmurs something to the person beside her. Richard feels the weight of every single gaze on him. He swallows, his throat suddenly dry. I was just being cautious," he stammers. "I didn't mean to what?" Celeste cuts him off, her voice dangerously calm. "Didn't mean to waste police resources. Didn't mean to assume my daughter didn't belong here. Didn't mean to weaponize your discomfort." Richard's face burns. I just thought, you thought she looked out of place." Celeste finishes for him. You saw a black girl alone in a public space, and instead of minding your own business, you decided she was a threat. Maya's chest tightens, hearing it said out loud, so plainly, so undeniably, makes her stomach churn. Richard's hands clench around his phone, but he has no defense, no words that don't sound hollow. And the bystanders? They see it now. They see him. Maya exhales slowly, her pulse still racing, but something inside her shifts. Because today, her mother didn't just fight for her. She exposed the problem. And now, the man who started it all has to sit with the weight of his choices. This is the kind of conversation people don't want to have. But it's real. It's raw. And it happens every single day. So, let me ask you, have you ever witnessed something like this? Have you ever seen someone make an assumption that had real consequences? Drop a comment below. And if you think more people need to hear stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe, because these conversations matter. Richard Calloway's throat bobs as he struggles for words, but there are none that will fix this. His entire body tenses, as if he can shrink under Celeste Carter's unwavering gaze. The bystanders aren't just watching anymore. They are witnessing. The difference is subtle, but Richard feels it like a noose tightening around his dignity. Celeste doesn't move closer, doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to. Her presence alone holds him there, pinned beneath the weight of his own actions. You thought you were protecting something, she says, her voice smooth as polished steel. But all you did was prove exactly why I've had to teach my daughter how to navigate a world that sees her as a threat first, and a person second. Richard swallows hard. Celeste shakes her head, cutting him off before he can stumble into another excuse. No, there's nothing you can say that will undo this moment. Nothing you can say that erases the fact that you saw my daughter, and your first instinct was to call the police. His fingers twitch around his phone. The same phone that started all of this. The same phone that, in another situation, with different officers, could have turned this entire day into something far worse. Celeste watches him, waiting. Not for an apology, because apologies mean nothing without change, but for something deeper. And then, she sees it. The slow, creeping realization behind his eyes. The understanding. Because now, Richard isn't just uncomfortable. He's afraid. Not of Maya, not of Celeste, but of himself. The jogger, the woman with the stroller, the kids near the basketball court. No one speaks, but the silence is heavier than any accusation. The officers shift. Reynolds clears his throat. If there's no issue here, we'll be on our way. Celeste turns to him, her eyes steady. Not yet. Martinez stiffens. Ma'am. Celeste's gaze sharpens. Do you understand the power you hold? She asks, cutting through his protest before it starts. Do you understand that your presence here alone was enough to make my daughter fear for her safety? That you, with a badge and a gun, could have escalated this beyond words, beyond reason, beyond something we could walk away from? Reynolds presses his lips into a thin line. Martinez says nothing. Celeste lets the moment stretch, lets them sit in the gravity of what almost happened. Then, finally, she exhales. I hope next time, you think before you act. Reynolds gives a stiff nod. Martinez mutters something under his breath. Neither of them meet Maya's eyes as they turn and walk back toward their patrol cars. Richard watches them go, his hand still gripping his phone like a lifeline. And just like that, the moment is over. But the weight of it? That will linger far longer. The patrol cars roll away, their red and blue lights flickering briefly before vanishing down the street. The tension in the air doesn't leave with them. It lingers, heavy, suffocating, wrapping around every single person who bore witness to what just happened. Maya exhales, shoulders slumping as if releasing a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. She should feel relieved, but instead, something unsettles her, something raw and unshakable. Celeste places a hand on her daughter's back. "You okay?" Maya nods, but it's automatic, mechanical. "You shouldn't have had to come here at all." Celeste sighs. "I know." They turn toward the car, their steps slow, deliberate. The world around them feels different. The trees still sway in the breeze. The swings still creak as a child rocks back and forth. The golden sunlight still spills across the pavement, but nothing feels the same. Because now, people are watching. The jogger who had slowed down earlier stands frozen, pretending to stretch, but his eyes betray him. The woman with the stroller grips the handle a little tighter, staring straight ahead as if forcing herself to act like she saw nothing. A group of teenagers at the basketball court whisper among themselves, their game forgotten. And Richard Calloway, he hasn't moved from his bench. His phone sits useless in his hands. Now, the screen dark. The man who once felt so sure of his instincts, so convinced he was doing the right thing, now sits in the wreckage of his own choices. Maya doesn't look at him. She doesn't need to. He isn't the first person to see her and assume the worst, and he won't be the last. Celeste unlocks the car, the soft beep breaking the silence. Maya hesitates before sliding into the passenger seat, staring straight ahead as she pulls the seatbelt across her chest. Her hands grip it tightly. Celeste glances at her daughter. "For today," she says softly, "it's over." Maya bites the inside of her cheek, her fingers still curled into the seatbelt. Her voice is quiet when she speaks. "And tomorrow?" Celeste doesn't lie. She never has. "Tomorrow," she says, starting the engine. "We keep going." The car pulls away, leaving behind the park, the bystanders, and Richard Calloway, who still hasn't moved. Because today, for the first time in his life, he had to sit with the consequences of his own fear. As Celeste and Maya drive away, the weight of the moment lingers, not just for them, but for everyone who saw it unfold. The park remains the same, yet something unspoken now hangs in the air. A question, a reckoning. Richard Calloway stays, rooted to his bench, his fingers still wrapped around his phone. But for the first time, he doesn't know what to do with it. The officers are gone. The situation has ended. And yet, a cold realization settles deep in his chest. His assumptions had consequences. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just an overreaction. It was a reminder. A reminder that, in a world where bias can turn an innocent moment into a dangerous one, a single choice, a phone call, a judgment, a decision made out of fear, can change everything. And what if Celeste hadn't arrived in time? What if the officers had been different? What if Maya, caught off guard, had reacted with frustration, with confusion? Would they have let her go? Or would this story have taken a darker turn? We already know the answer. This isn't just Maya's story. It's a reality faced by countless people every single day. A reality built on assumptions, on perceptions, on quiet fears that turn into loud consequences. So the next time you catch yourself making a judgment about someone, pause. Ask yourself, why am I seeing them this way? What story am I telling myself about them? And what could happen if I act on that story? Because assumptions have power, and some mistakes, they can't be undone. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen a moment where bias shaped the way someone was treated? What did you do? What would you do differently now? Let's talk about it. And if you believe these conversations matter, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because stories like this need to be told.